What unfolded during those 6 hours will be analyzed in military academies for decades to come, not simply because of the destruction it caused, but because of what it exposed about the true distribution of power in the modern world. Within a single night, 2,000 Iranian kamikaze drones transformed the skies above Tel Aviv into a blazing inferno, reduced three of Israel's most strategically vital military bases to ruins, and pushed the most formidable naval armada ever assembled into a quiet retreat toward the safety of distant waters. This was no border skirmish, this was no show of force, this was a declaration delivered in metal and fire, a message to the world that the age of unchallenged Western dominance over the Middle East had reached its final chapter. When the opening wave of Shahd drones crossed into Israeli airspace at precisely 2:17 in the morning local time, radar operators at the Palm Air Defense Complex witnessed something their screens had never shown before. Not dozens of incoming contacts, not hundreds, 2,000 simultaneous signatures materializing from multiple directions across a front stretching from the Lebanese border all the way to the Jordanian corridor. The sheer volume shattered every established protocol. Systems built to handle saturation attacks of 60-80 targets at once were now being pushed 30 times beyond their designed operational limits. The tracking algorithms collapsed under the load, interception queues overflowed, and one after another, the gaps in Israel's celebrated air defense shield began tearing open like wounds that nothing could seal. By the time dawn arrived, Tel Aviv's skyline carried a darkness that had nothing to do with the early hour. The fires consuming the Gush Dan metropolitan corridor, Israel's economic and military core, were visible to pilots aboard commercial aircraft cruising above Cyprus. Three major IDF command centers had been rendered completely non-functional. The port facilities at Ashdod lay paralyzed, and out in the Gulf of Oman, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, a symbol of American global reach for 3 decades, was accelerating away from Iranian anti-ship missile range. Its withdrawal was captured in real time by satellite imagery that circulated publicly within hours. What happened that night was no accident. It was the result of years of methodical preparation, strategic restraint, and a weapons development program that Western analysts had persistently underestimated, not because the evidence was absent, but because dismissing Iranian capability was far more comfortable than honestly confronting it. The lesson that surfaced from the ashes of that night is the same lesson that collapsing empires throughout history have always learned too late. Underestimate a determined and self-sufficient people for long enough, and when the reckoning finally arrives, it will dwarf every prior calculation. The fire that burned across Israel's military heartland that night was not merely the result of drones and warheads. It was the product of a civilization that had decided, quietly and with absolute resolve, that it would no longer ask permission to defend itself. To truly grasp what happened that night, one must first understand what 2,000 simultaneous drone contacts actually mean for any defensive system on Earth. The number is not simply large, it is specifically, deliberately, and mathematically engineered to breach the physical and computational boundaries of the technology Israel had deployed. Every assumption embedded in the design of those defensive systems, every calculation made by the engineers who built them, simply did not account for what Iran unleashed. Iron Dome was conceived as a point defense platform. Its radar architecture and fire control systems were optimized to engage a defined number of simultaneous threats within a specific geographic zone. The Tamir interceptor missile travels at roughly 250 meters per second and requires a minimum engagement window to acquire, lock onto, and destroy an incoming target under standard operational conditions. The system performs with remarkable reliability, but standard conditions involve dozens of threats, not thousands. The opening wave consisted of approximately 600 Shahd 136 Delta Wing loitering munitions, the baseline platform now extensively battle-tested across multiple conflict zones. These flew at altitudes ranging between 500 and 1,500 meters, following pre-programmed flight paths that deliberately threaded through valleys and coastal terrain features specifically chosen to minimize radar acquisition time. Each carried a 40-kilogram warhead more than sufficient to obliterate a radar installation, collapse a fuel storage facility, or trigger a catastrophic chain detonation inside an ammunition depot with a single impact. Woven throughout that first wave were approximately 400 Shad 238 variants, the jet-powered evolution of the platform capable of traveling at nearly double the speed of the original model, where the baseline Shad grants a defending system roughly for 2-6 minutes between radar acquisition and potential impact. The 238 compresses that window to under 90 seconds. 90 seconds is not enough time for a human operator to confirm a track, authorize an engagement, fire an interceptor, assess the outcome, and shift attention to the next target demanding a response. The second wave, launched approximately 40 minutes after the first, introduced over 1,000 additional platforms entering Israeli airspace from an entirely different direction through Syrian and Iraqi corridors that had been deliberately kept quiet in the weeks prior to avoid triggering elevated alert conditions. By the time this second wave arrived, Iron Dome batteries across the northern and central sectors were already running critically low on interceptor inventory from the demands of the first engagement. That timing was not coincidental. It was the product of operational planning that had studied Israeli defensive reload cycles with precision and deliberately timed the second strike to arrive at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. The third and final wave, approximately 400 platforms concentrated exclusively against Greater Tel Aviv and the Negev military corridor, arrived when the defensive network was in a state of near-total resource exhaustion. Multiple batteries had completely expended their ready-to-fire interceptor loads and were midway through. Manual reloading cycles requiring between 30 and 90 minutes to complete. The drones that penetrated during this final phase encountered virtually no organized resistance. They navigated to their designated targets in near silence, the only sound being the distinctive turbine hum that survivors would later describe as the most terrifying noise they had ever heard in their lives. The targeting logic that emerged from post-strike damage assessments revealed a strategic intelligence operating far beyond simple destruction. The Palm Makim Air Base radar installation was eliminated in the opening minutes of the first wave, deliberately degrading Israel's long-range aerial picture at the precise moment it was most critically needed. The Gilo intelligence complex absorbed multiple direct hits that rendered significant portions of its most sensitive infrastructure completely non-operational. The Ashdod port fuel terminal, through which a substantial share of Israel's military petroleum imports flow, received 17 individual drone impacts that ignited fires burning for over 14 consecutive hours. The Kiryat military headquarters in central Tel Aviv, housing the IDF General Staff and serving as the central nervous system of Israeli military command, was targeted by a concentrated package of over 60 drones during the third wave. The compound's close-in defense systems intercepted a meaningful portion, but at least 11 drones penetrated the perimeter and detonated inside the complex. The disruption to command coordination during the most critical hours of the engagement cannot be overstated. This was not random destruction scattered across a map. Every single target in the Iranian strike package was selected for its specific role in either Israel's defensive response capability or its logistical and command sustainment architecture. The message embedded in the targeting list was precise and unmistakable. Iran was not attempting to terrorize a civilian population. It was methodically dismantling a military machine node by node, system by system, with a calculated patience that spoke of planning conducted over years rather than weeks. The Western defense establishment had spent considerable time and intellectual energy dismissing the Shad family of loitering munitions as unsophisticated, inexpensive imitations of outdated concepts, weapons that any technologically advanced adversary could neutralize without significant difficulty. That dismissal was always rooted more in comfort than in honest analysis. The events of that night retired it permanently. What Iran constructed is not a copy of anything that came before it. It is an original weapons system family, refined through real operational experience into one of the most strategically consequential platforms deployed by any military force operating in the world today. At 4:43 in the morning Gulf Standard Time, satellite tracking data confirmed what American defense officials would spend the following hours carefully avoiding any public acknowledgement of: the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, accompanied by its full complement of escort vessels including two Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, had increased speed and altered course away from its forward operating position in the northern Gulf of Oman toward a station approximately 400 nautical miles further from the Iranian coastline. The official Pentagon characterization that this represented a routine tactical repositioning consistent with standard force protection protocols is a phrase specifically engineered to be technically accurate while remaining entirely misleading in its operational significance. Every movement of a naval vessel is technically routine in the sense that it follows established procedures. What is not routine is a carrier strike group abandoning a forward operating position in the middle of an active regional conflict involving its closest regional ally at the precise moment that ally is absorbing the largest drone assault in the recorded history of modern warfare. The departure of the Lincoln from its forward station was not a procedural footnote. It was a strategic event whose implications would echo across every capital on Earth within hours. What drove the decision was the convergence of two simultaneous threat streams that the strike group's own defensive assessment concluded could not be managed together within acceptable risk boundaries. The first was the activation of Iran's shore-based anti-ship missile batteries along the Iranian coastline, specifically the Khalij Fars anti-ship ballistic missile system, a maneuvering re-entry vehicle carrying a seeker head engineered specifically to acquire and track large naval surface targets during its terminal phase. The Khalij Fars descends at hypersonic velocities, and its capacity to maneuver in the final seconds of flight presents a fundamentally different interception challenge compared to conventional anti-ship cruise missiles. The SM-6 interceptors aboard the strike group's escort vessels have demonstrated meaningful capability against certain categories of ballistic missile threats, but the combination of hypersonic terminal velocity and late-stage maneuvering pushes against the absolute outer limits of current naval air defense technology. The second threat stream was the Iranian naval presence in the immediate operating area. Iranian fast attack vessels, coastal submarines, and mine-laying assets had been observed conducting what American analysts assessed as deliberate prepositioning movements in the days preceding the drone strike. The combined tactical picture suggested a coordinated multi-axis harassment and attrition capability that, when layered on top of the shore-based missile threat, created an operating environment that the strike group's defensive architecture was simply not designed to absorb indefinitely at full combat tempo. From a pure force protection standpoint, the decision to reposition was operationally rational. It preserved irreplaceable strategic assets and safeguarded the lives of several thousand American sailors from a risk environment that had exceeded any reasonable threshold for continued forward presence. But operational rationality and strategic consequence are entirely separate calculations, and the strategic consequence of an American carrier group withdrawing from a combat theater in direct response to Iranian military pressure, regardless of the tactical justification offered, is a data point that every government on Earth immediately began processing and filing against future assessments of American security guarantees. For Israel, the departure of the Lincoln Strike Group from forward operating range carried immediate and concrete operational consequences. American carrier aviation had been a foundational component of the regional air defense architecture, providing supplementary radar coverage, electronic warfare support, and the implicit threat of American strike packages that had historically constrained Iranian operational planning. With that asset relocated to a position from which its air wing could no longer practically contribute to the Israeli defensive effort, Tel Aviv found itself, for the first time in recent memory, genuinely operating without the full spectrum American backstop it had long treated as a permanent and unconditional fixture of its national security. The implications radiated far beyond the immediate tactical picture. NATO allies across Eastern Europe quietly began updating their own assessments of American commitment durability under genuine combat pressure. Gulf states that had structured their entire national security architectures around American basing rights and rapid reinforcement. Guarantees convened emergency national security reviews. The message transmitted by the Lincoln's repositioning that American force protection calculations can override alliance commitment when the threat environment becomes sufficiently severe is one that fundamentally reshapes strategic planning in capitals stretching from Warsaw to Riyadh to Taipei. In Moscow, senior strategic planners who had spent years arguing that American alliance commitments are conditional rather than absolute now possessed an operational data point validating that assessment in the most public and unambiguous manner imaginable. The Kremlin's public response was characteristically measured while its internal deliberations were almost certainly far more animated. Russia had maintained a carefully calibrated relationship with Iran deep enough to include meaningful defense technology cooperation across multiple domains, restrained enough to avoid triggering direct Western escalation responses. The events of that night validated that strategic investment without requiring any additional Russian action or expenditure of any kind. In Beijing, the calculation was similarly favorable. China's relationship with Iran encompasses energy supply agreements, infrastructure investment under the Belt and Road Framework, and defense technology cooperation that Western intelligence services had tracked with mounting concern across recent years. The demonstration that Iranian military capability partially enabled by Chinese technology transfers and diplomatic protection could successfully challenge the American-Israeli security architecture in the most direct manner possible, strengthened Beijing's negotiating position across every bilateral relationship in which American security guarantees remain a relevant consideration. Taiwan's government absorbed the events of that night with a quality of attention that its carefully composed public statements would not fully reflect. The unspoken question circulating through Taipei's national security establishment was one that required no verbalization. If an American carrier group repositioned away from an ally, absorbing an active large-scale attack, what did that mean for an island nation separated from a nuclear-armed neighbor by a strait measuring 110 miles at its narrowest point? For the broader developing world, the nations of Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia that had spent decades navigating between American pressure and the aspiration for genuine strategic independence, the events of that night constituted a historical reference point of the first order, the foundational narrative sustaining American global influence that the only rational security strategy available to a smaller state is alignment with Washington's preference structure, had now encountered a living and undeniable counterexample. Iran, comprehensively sanctioned for 5 decades, subjected to repeated military and intelligence attacks, cut off from the global financial system, had demonstrated the capacity to field military capability that forced an American carrier group to reposition. If that outcome was achievable, the entire logic of enforced strategic dependency demanded fundamental re-examination. There exists a category of strategic asset that appears on no defense procurement ledger, cannot be manufactured in any weapons facility, and cannot be weakened by any sanctions regime regardless of its severity. It is the collective will of a people who have decided not as a government policy but as a civilizational conviction that they will not accept the subordination of their sovereignty to outside powers, regardless of what resistance costs them. Iran's decision to launch 2,000 drones against the most heavily defended airspace in the Middle East was not made from a position of comfortable strength. It was made by a leadership carrying the weight of 5 decades of comprehensive economic warfare, the targeted killing of its most senior military commanders and nuclear scientists, repeated sabotage operations against its industrial infrastructure, and the continuous threat of military assault from a nuclear-armed regional adversary backed by the world's most powerful military. In that context, the strike was not aggression. It was the logical endpoint of a strategic calculation that had exhausted every alternative path toward security. The technological reality underlying this night carries a meaning that transcends the purely military dimension. Every component of the Shahd platform family, from composite airframe materials to engine systems to guidance electronics, is domestically produced within Iran's own defense industrial ecosystem. 5 decades of sweeping sanctions, technology transfer restrictions, and export control regimes did not prevent this development. They accelerated it by eliminating every alternative path and concentrating Iranian engineering talent on the single objective of building precisely what external pressure was designed to make impossible. The irony is structural and complete. The instruments designed to guarantee Iranian strategic weakness became the primary engine of the strategic capability now confronting their architects. The contrast between Israeli dependence on American resupply for every interceptor expended and Iranian self-sufficiency in producing its own weapons is not merely an economic observation. It reflects two fundamentally different relationships between a state and its own security, a nation that must seek approval from a foreign government. To replenish its primary defensive munition has, at a deep structural level, outsourced its sovereignty alongside its logistics. The geopolitical architecture governing the Middle East since the Cold War rested on assumptions that were always more fragile than their architects acknowledged. American military primacy was treated as self-sustaining and indefinitely projectable. Israeli technological superiority was assumed to guarantee security outcomes regardless of threat scale. That night, both assumptions were stress-tested simultaneously and neither survived intact.